Chapter 2, The Smith Family Origin. Part A, Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith. Picture New England in the 1770s. Clapboard houses, frost on the fields, and sermons heavy with damnation. Amid that austere world stood Asael Smith, a farmer, thinker, and quiet heretic. While neighbors clung to the doctrine that most souls were born damned, Asael dared to believe otherwise. He saw a God too vast to be cruel, a universe too ordered to be hopeless. In that conviction lay the seed of something larger, a family unafraid to wrestle with heaven, to seek its own truth, and eventually to claim revelation as their own. The seeds of dissent. Asael Smith, born in mid-18th century New England, was a man whose life blended intellect, faith, and practical savvy. From an early age, he demonstrated a restless curiosity, questioning the rigid religious doctrines that surrounded him. Unlike many neighbors who adhered strictly to Calvinist teachings of election and damnation, Asael embraced universalism, the belief that all souls would ultimately be reconciled to God. His choice was both moral and pragmatic. Universalists did not pay taxes to support local churches they did not attend, allowing Asael to live in harmony with his conscience while keeping his family's modest finances intact. Morally upright by the standards of his Massachusetts community, Asael combined his faith with industriousness, supporting his household through farming, small trade, and careful management of resources. When he moved to Tunbridge, Vermont, however, he entered the frontier, land rougher, sparser, and far less forgiving, and there he demonstrated an ability to navigate these harsher realities, balancing labor with intellectual and spiritual curiosity. Some historians, such as LDS scholar Richard K. Behrens, have speculated that Asael's family may have been related to John Smith, a Dartmouth College professor of theology and Hebrew studies. Whether or not the connection was direct, it placed Asael within a broader milieu of learned New England families, where education, scholarship, and religious inquiry intersected. This intellectual environment would indirectly shape Joseph Smith Sr., instilling a sense that faith, learning, and practical skill could coexist, even in a household far from the lecture halls of Dartmouth. According to the LDS Church website, in 1797, Asael, Joseph Sr., and one of his brothers joined the Universalist movement while in Vermont, though the account does not specify which brother. Joseph Sr.'s involvement in this movement left a lasting impression on Joseph Jr. during his teenage years. However, not all of Asael's descendants later supported Joseph Jr.'s religious claims. For example, his uncle Jesse would go on to denounce the visions as deception. Asael's moral framework and universalist outlook left a lasting imprint. His emphasis on conscience, fairness, and the potential for human improvement would echo in the upbringing of his son, Joseph Smith Sr., who inherited not only his father's ambition and charm, but also his belief in a benevolent, accessible God. It was into this world, rooted in moral earnestness, theological reflection, and a touch of scholarly influence, that Joseph Smith Sr. was born, setting the stage for the choices and ventures that would define both his life and, decades later, that of his son. Before Joseph Smith Jr. ever made a name for himself in the rolling hills and dense forests of early 19th century Vermont and New Hampshire, his family had already laid the groundwork for the man he would become. Most Latter-day Saints hear only fragments of that story, usually the dramatic, faith-centered moments, yet few ever learn about his parents in any real depth. To understand Joseph Jr., we must first step into the world he was born into, one of hard labor, fragile fortunes, and layered beliefs. This is where the story truly begins, not in the whispered serenity of a grove in 1820, but in the homes, farms, and communities that shaped the young man long before his visions. Joseph Jr.'s upbringing left an indelible mark on his character and choices. He remembered his father, Joseph Smith Sr., with clear admiration. He was a great and a good man. The envy of knaves and fools was heaped upon him. He was of noble stature and possessed a high and holy and exalted and virtuous mind. I love my father and his memory, and the memory of his noble deeds rests with ponderous weight upon my mind, and many of his kind and parental words to me are written on the tablet of my heart. It's an almost scriptural remembrance, one that sanctifies the father even as it shields the family's struggles from view. This portrait, while heartfelt, blends reverence with youthful memory, making it difficult to separate affection from fact. Yet other accounts from neighbors, business associates, and later historians provide a broader, sometimes harsher perspective. Together, they paint a picture of a man both charismatic and flawed, someone whose ambitions, charm, and occasional misjudgments would ripple through the family and influence the choices of the next generation. Schemes and setbacks. Joseph Smith Sr. was born in July 1772 in Topsfield, Massachusetts, a small town marked by tree-lined roads, modest clapboard homes, and the quiet rhythm of rural New England life. He was the son of Asael Smith, growing up amid the moral earnestness and intellectual curiosity that his father embodied. Although several of his brothers would later join the church, remarkably little reliable information about Joseph Sr. comes directly from family accounts. Much of what we know stems from Lucy Mack Smith, who recorded her recollections decades after many events had passed. Yet she was not the only source. Neighbors and contemporaries later offered testimony, often recorded after Joseph Jr. had begun work on the Book of Mormon. From these fragments, a portrait emerges of a man ambitious and charismatic, but repeatedly plagued by business failures and accusations of untrustworthiness. The pattern was unmistakable. Ambitious and charismatic, but fatally impulsive, Joseph Sr. drifted from scheme to scheme. LDS narratives often soften these failures as misfortune, but his judgment was repeatedly flawed, trusting easily, managing poorly, and chasing fortune faster than he could earn it. Whether swindled or simply reckless, the result was always the same. Another farm lost, another debt unpaid, another move in the night. Tunbridge, Vermont, 1796 to 1802. Joseph Smith Sr. entered marriage with ambition, but little discipline. The first farm was in Tunbridge, a small plot he rented shortly after marrying Lucy in 1796. The land was already tired. Previous tenants had worked it hard, pulling what they could from thin soil before moving on. Joseph cleared brush through the summer heat, sweat staining his shirt, while Lucy swept the cramped cabin and tried to make it feel like home. He planted corn and wheat in neat rows, told Lucy they'd have their own place soon, a real farm, something to pass down. But the yields were poor. The soil gave reluctantly, and by the second season, Joseph was behind on rent. He borrowed to buy seed, promised payment at harvest, then watched helplessly as early frost crept across the fields in September, killing half the crop where it stood. The remaining grain barely filled a wagon. By 1802, creditors were knocking. He sold what little equity he had, a plow, some tools, the lease itself, at a loss, and moved on, telling Lucy the next place would be better. It always would be, he said. The next place always would be. Randolph, Vermont, 1802-1803. Randolph was supposed to be the fresh start. Joseph leased another parcel in the spring of 1802, this one larger, with a weathered cabin and a stream that ran clear and cold. He worked the fields with renewed determination that first season, rising before dawn, blisters forming on his palms, shoulders aching as he guided the plow through rocky soil. For a few months, it seemed possible. Lucy planted a vegetable garden beside the cabin, carrots, beans, squash, and hung curtains in the windows. The children played in the yard, their laughter drifting across the fields where Joseph worked. But Joseph had borrowed again, this time from a neighbor, to buy a cow and a few pigs, animals that would provide milk, meat, and security. When the harvest came in light, barely enough to feed the family through winter, he couldn't make the payments. The neighbor was patient at first, then less so, his visits growing terse and pointed. By the following spring, Joseph had abandoned the lease in the night, loading the wagon by moonlight, Lucy wrapping bread and cheese in cloth while the children slept. They slipped away before the creditors could claim what little they had left. Another silent departure, another town left behind. Sharon, Vermont, 1803-1805. In Sharon, Joseph rented from his father-in-law, Solomon Mack, a Revolutionary War veteran with a stern face and little patience for excuses. It should have been easier, family helping family, blood supporting blood, but Joseph chafed under the arrangement. He felt Solomon's eyes on him constantly, measuring every decision, noting every delay. He worked the land half-heartedly, distracted by rumors of better opportunities elsewhere, by talk in the village of land grants opening up, of fortunes made overnight. When Lucy gave birth to Joseph Jr. in a small, drafty cabin in December 1805, the wind howled through gaps in the walls, and the fire struggled to keep the cold at bay. The farm was already failing. Joseph had planted late, harvested poorly, and spent too many evenings talking rather than working. Solomon Mack said nothing, but his silence was louder than any reproach, a judgment that hung in the air at every family meal. By the time Joseph Jr. was a toddler, the family was on the move again. Solomon did not try to stop them. Royalton, Vermont, 1804 to 1807. Royalton brought a brief flicker of hope. Joseph leased a larger farm in 1804, convinced this time he could make it work. The land rolled gently toward a wooded hillside, the soil darker and richer than anything he'd worked before. He planted ambitiously, wheat, corn, barley, and talked about expanding, maybe buying the land outright someday, building a real house with proper rooms and a stone chimney. Lucy wanted desperately to believe him. The children were growing, they needed stability, a place to call home, but Joseph's attention wandered. He spent long afternoons talking with neighbors about treasure hunts, about divining rods that bent toward gold, about seer stones that revealed what lay hidden beneath the earth. Men gathered in barns and clearings, speaking in low voices about buried fortunes left by Spanish explorers or pirates who'd traveled inland. Joseph listened, enthralled, his imagination kindling with each tale. The fields went neglected. Weeds overtook the rows of corn, choking out the young stalks. The wheat grew thin and weak, vulnerable to disease. By the time Joseph realized the season was lost, it was too late. The landlord came in the fall, demanding payment Joseph didn't have. The family packed again, this time heading to West Lebanon, New Hampshire, where Joseph decided to try something different, a store, where success didn't depend on weather or soil or the whims of nature. West Lebanon, Randolph Store, 1811 to 1813. The store was Joseph's boldest gamble yet. In 1811, he borrowed heavily from a Boston company to stock the shelves. Bolts of bright cloth, iron tools, sacks of salt and sugar, barrels of molasses, everything a frontier family might need. The little shop smelled of leather and dried herbs, of possibility. For a few weeks it seemed to work. Farmers came in, ran their hands over the goods, nodded approvingly. They bought what they needed and promised to pay at harvest. Joseph kept a ledger, carefully recording names and amounts, but the columns filled with promises, not coins. By the second year, letters arrived from Boston, increasingly urgent, demanding payment. Joseph tried to collect from the farmers, riding out to their homesteads, but they offered excuses, bad crops, sick livestock, just a bit more time. Promises were all he had, and promises wouldn't satisfy the creditors. The store collapsed under the weight of its own debt. Shelves emptied. The Boston company threatened legal action. That's when Joseph heard about the ginseng opportunity, a last desperate chance to salvage everything, to turn disaster into triumph with one bold stroke. The ginseng disaster, 1813. Joseph had labored through the summer of 1813, gathering ginseng roots from the forest floor. Pale, gnarled things that looked like twisted fingers reaching up from the soil. Each root was worth money, real money, and Joseph had collected enough to fill several crates. When Mr. Stevens of Royalton offered $3,000 for the lot, Joseph's heart pounded. It was more money than he'd seen in years, enough to clear the $1,800 debt to the Boston company, enough to pay off the store's creditors, enough to start fresh with real capital this time. But Joseph hesitated. Stevens was a middleman, and middlemen took their cut. If Joseph shipped the ginseng to New York himself, he could deal directly with buyers, get the full price, maybe even more than $3,000. It was too good an opportunity to pass up. So Joseph traveled to New York in the autumn, arranged for the shipment with a reputable merchant, and waited for the sale that would change everything. The city bustled with commerce, ships in the harbor, merchants haggling on the docks, money changing hands. Joseph walked those streets imagining his own success, already planning how he'd invest the profits. What he didn't know was that Stevens had followed him to New York, quietly noting which ship carried the ginseng, which merchant Joseph had contracted with. Stevens was careful, asking subtle questions, learning the details without raising suspicion. Then he sent his own son to the merchant, presenting himself as representing both his father and Joseph Smith. The merchant, seeing no reason to doubt him, completed the sale. The ginseng sold well, very well, better than Joseph had dared hope. But when Stephen's son returned to Vermont, he told a different story. The market had been poor, he said. The roots hadn't fetched much. He handed Joseph a chest of tea, fragrant, expensive tea, but worthless compared to what was owed, and claimed it was all the sale had yielded after expenses. Joseph suspected something was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. He made inquiries, wrote letters, and slowly the truth emerged. Stephen's son had pocketed most of the money. By the time Joseph learned the full extent of the fraud, Stevens himself had already fled to Canada, beyond the reach of Vermont law, beyond any hope of recovery. The $1,800 debt to Boston remained, immovable as a boulder. The store was finished. Creditors circled like crows over a carcass, demanding payment, threatening lawsuits. Joseph was forced to sell the farm, assessed at $1,500, but sold in desperation for a mere $800 to satisfy the most pressing debt. To cover the remaining shortfall, Lucy made the hardest sacrifice of all. She gave up the $1,000 she had received as a wedding gift, money she had kept aside for years, hidden away against catastrophe, her last reserve. Now it was gone, fed into the maw of Joseph's collapsed ventures. The family avoided formal legal entanglements, but they were ruined. Their resources had been depleted by misplaced trust, poor judgment, and the lure of one more big score. Joseph Sr. had been defrauded, yes, swindled by men more cunning and ruthless than himself. But he had also overreached, trusting a business partner he barely knew, risking everything on a shipment he couldn't oversee, convinced that fortune was finally turning in his favor. It never did. Norwich, New Hampshire, 1814 to 1816. After the ginseng disaster and the store's collapse, Joseph moved the family to Norwich, New Hampshire, in 1814. They leased a farm there and mortgaged their few remaining livestock, 2 cows, a handful of chickens, to buy seed and basic tools. The land was poor, the soil thin and prone to disease. Joseph planted what he could, but the crops came in stunted and weak, stalks pale and drooping. He borrowed again, this time from neighbors who knew his history, but took pity on the family. Joseph promised repayment after the next harvest, his voice earnest, his eyes tired. Lucy stopped asking about the future. She tended the children, mended their clothes until the fabric was more patched than original cloth, and prayed. Then came 1816, the year without a summer, the year the sky itself seemed to curse them. Frost struck in June, a killing cold that descended overnight and blackened the young crops where they stood. Farmers across New England stood in their fields at dawn, staring at the ruin, unable to comprehend what nature had done. Joseph replanted what he could, working frantically, but it was hopeless. August brought frost again. Ice formed on water troughs. The few struggling plants died. There would be no harvest. Not for Joseph, not for anyone. Feed prices for livestock doubled, then tripled, as farmers scrambled to keep their animals alive. Joseph couldn't pay the mortgage on the cows, couldn't pay back the neighbors, couldn't even afford to feed the chickens. One by one, he sold the animals at a loss just to buy a few more weeks of food for the family. By fall, the creditors were closing in. Neighbors who had lent money now needed it back for their own survival. The landlord wanted the overdue rent. Joseph had nothing left to give. In October, under cover of darkness, the Smiths loaded their few remaining possessions into a borrowed wagon. Lucy bundled the children in thin blankets, her face drawn and pale in the moonlight. They left without saying goodbye, without settling accounts, slipping away before anyone could stop them. They headed west toward New York, toward cheaper land, toward places where no one knew Joseph's name, toward one last chance. It was the only direction left to go. Even as the family struggled to survive, Joseph Sr.'s restless curiosity and appetite for risk extended beyond mere farming. His imagination sought signs, secrets, and hidden fortunes in a world that seemed to promise both danger and reward. Yet Joseph Sr.'s life was never only about money. He belonged to scrying clubs, secretive circles devoted to divining buried treasures, a theme that would run through the family story for generations. At least 3 times, mismanagement and misfortune had led him to lose the family farm entirely. He was also embroiled in a fraud case that eventually reached the courts, a thread we will return to when examining Oliver Cowdery's involvement. His repeated losses did not extinguish his ambition. They redirected it. What he could not secure through trade or farming, he began to pursue through faith, magic, and vision. Joseph Sr.'s beliefs and interests went beyond conventional religion. His fascination with visions, the occult, and supernatural practices deeply shaped the worldview of his children, particularly Joseph Jr. Yet LD often reduced Smith Sr.'s role to a minor supporting character, primarily as the man Joseph approached about the first vision and as one of the 8 witnesses, overlooking the broader, formative influence he exerted on his son's imagination, ambition, and understanding of the spiritual world. Meanwhile, Joseph Sr. actively participated in treasure hunts, immersing himself in organized ritualistic expeditions rooted in folk magic and the occult. These were far from casual pastimes. They were secretive, underground networks suffused with apocalyptic beliefs and mystical practices. The groups he associated with were more than clubs. They were clandestine societies steeped in ritual, where treasure hunts were framed as religious endeavors, blending devotion with the promise of material reward. From 1802 to 1804, Smith Sr. became heavily involved in the wood scrape movement in Vermont, an apocalyptic, divination-centered cult of folk magic that fused religious zeal with supernatural practices. This was not a benign, faith-based hobby. It was an immersive subculture of mystical belief and treasure-seeking, reflecting the shadowy edges of early American folk magic. LDS narratives conveniently omit these details, including the fact that Smith Sr.'s participation in the wood scrape movement was not isolated. Oliver Cowdery's father, William Cowdery, was likely involved as well. Through marriage, William was related to Joseph Smith Sr., entwining the families more deeply into these occult circles. The Smiths were no casual dabblers in folk magic. In the forests and fields of early 19th century New England, they were knee-deep in it, their daily lives intertwined with the search for hidden wealth and supernatural guidance. Their tools were as varied as they were strange. Polished seer stones, smooth and dark as river pebbles, used to reveal buried treasures. Divining rods, simple but potent in their eyes, bending subtly in the hands of the practiced. Inscribed parchments, covered in mysterious symbols and charms, believed to summon protection or guide the fortunate to untold riches. Some parchments were carried in pockets, others buried in the soil, still others laid on windowsills to catch moonlight or ward off malevolent spirits. Water was poured ceremonially over marked ground, invocations whispered at twilight. Each object carried ritual significance, each excursion into the woods a careful, solemn performance, blending hope, superstition, and inherited lore. Joseph Smith Sr. treated these expeditions with the seriousness of a tradesman balancing his books or a farmer reading the sky for frost. He reportedly used a peep stone to locate hidden caches of gold, confident that it could reveal secrets buried beneath the New England soil. In 1822, he pointed out a spot near their home to Peter Ingersoll. "If you only knew the value there is back of my house. There," exclaimed he, "is one chest of gold and another of silver." His conviction was absolute. It was not idle fantasy. The Smith family believed the land itself whispered to those who knew how to listen. Lucy Mack Smith, ever the chronicler, confirmed this obsession. "I had often been told by my husband that there was a large treasure hid in the ground, and he believed that it could be found." The rituals were elaborate. The family would pace around the marked spots, sometimes at night, rods in hand, whispering invocations to awaken the treasure's presence. Neighboring farmers might laugh or shake their heads, but these secretive practices were part of the cultural fabric of rural Vermont and New York, a mix of frontier desperation, folk magic, and apocalyptic hope. Joseph and Alvin grew up in this world. Alvin, the eldest, took to it naturally, using divining rods not just for gold but for water, becoming a practical magician of sorts, blending survival skills with inherited superstition. Joseph, still a boy, absorbed it all, the thrill, the ritual, the mingling of the mundane with the extraordinary. The obsession was family doctrine. Work hard, dig deep, watch the signs, and perhaps the earth itself would reward your faith. This was not a household of mere play or casual superstition. It was a training ground for imagination, enterprise, and risk-taking. where folklore, family lore, and daily survival blended seamlessly. The tools, the rituals, and the obsessive belief in hidden treasures were more than eccentricities. They were the framework that shaped Joseph Smith, Jr., teaching him to see possibility, to act boldly, and to trust that the unseen world could guide human endeavor. A persistent story places Joseph Smith Sr. among the Masons of upstate New York. Terry, in Freemasonry and the Church of Latter-day Saints, even names the date, May 7, 1818, claiming he was raised to the degree of Master Mason in Ontario Lodge No. 23 at Canandaigua. The problem is that no lodge record has ever turned up to prove it. Dan Vogel and most historians dismiss the tale as a mix-up. The census of 1830 lists 9 different Joseph Smiths in Ontario and Wayne counties, any one of whom could have been the man in the Masonic minutes, if such a record ever existed. Faith and resilience. Lucy Mack's story begins in Gilsum, New Hampshire, where she was born on July 8, 1775. By the time she married Joseph Smith Sr., tragedy had already marked her young life. She had lost 2 sisters to tuberculosis, one of whom she had raised since the age of 16. To recover from this grief, Lucy moved in with her brother Stephen in Tunbridge, Vermont, an experience that shaped her resilience. Lucy's father, Solomon Mack, was a Revolutionary War veteran who did not subscribe to organized religion, leaving his wife, Lydia Gale, to instill faith in their children. Reports indicate Solomon did not convert to any denomination until 1810, after Lucy had married and left home. The LDS Church portrays her upbringing differently. Lucy Mack grew up in a deeply religious home. In her search for salvation, Lucy studied the Bible, prayed, discussed dreams and visions, and attended religious meetings and revivals sponsored by various denominations. We do know, however, that Lucy herself spoke of believing in visions and claimed that her husband's experiences, as well as Joseph Jr.'s, came from God. In 1802, tuberculosis struck again, this time threatening Lucy herself. Confined to her bed in the small, timbered home she shared with her family, she later wrote, "During the night I made a solemn covenant with God, that if he would let me live, I would endeavor to serve him according to the best of my abilities. Shortly after this I heard a voice say to me, 'Let your heart be comforted, ye believe in God, believe also in me.'" A week after her recovery, tragedy struck once more. Joseph Sr.'s 17-year-old brother, Stephen, died suddenly, likely from the same relentless disease. While in Sharon, Vermont, in 1805, a village of modest clapboard houses nestled amid rolling hills and river valleys, Joseph Smith Jr. was born. The family, however, did not remain there long due to Joseph Sr.'s ongoing business failures. They moved to Tunbridge in the winter of 1807-08, then to Royalton, and by 1811 had settled in West Lebanon, New Hampshire, a river town dotted with small mills and farms. That same year, Hiram Smith began attending Moore's Charity School, a branch of Dartmouth College where their great-uncle taught and preached. Records indicate Hiram remained enrolled until 1814. Meanwhile, Joseph Sr.'s reputation for financial missteps worsened. LDS sources soften the story, describing the family as victims of poor harvests and rigid Vermont laws. But as we saw earlier, this was not the case. After 2 years of successive crop failures, the Smiths were warned out as newcomers legally unable to claim support from the town under Vermont's poor laws. They borrowed money and resolved to try farming one more season. Unfortunately, 1816 proved to be one of the worst years for farming in Vermont history. An infamous summer remembered across New England for frost in July and ruinous harvests. The reality was sharper. Joseph Sr. had repeatedly borrowed money he could not repay, and creditors began pressing as soon as they heard the family was preparing to leave. Lucy recorded the ordeal with measured patience, noting that friends urged her to take legal action, but a woman alone, she knew, would never hold her own in court. Lucy knew the family was in the wrong. The family's poverty became painfully tangible during the journey to New York. A hired wagoner, realizing the Smiths could not pay, abandoned them roughly 100 miles from Palmyra. Lucy bartered scraps of cloth and worn clothing for food and lodging, while her 13-year-old daughter, Sophronia, contributed whatever meager earnings she could earn from small tasks along the road. Every mile of the journey pressed them further into exhaustion and uncertainty, a physical embodiment of Joseph Jr., submerging lessons in resilience and survival. Even amidst hardships and networks subtly influenced the family's path. Joseph Sr. was an alleged Freemason, as was Hiram, who records show was raised into the craft on February 16th. These affiliations threaded a line of influence, opportunity, and shared culture that would continue to intersect with the family's future religious endeavors, hinting at the complex social world behind the public narrative of frontier life. By 1821, the Smith family had lost yet another farm, a bitter repetition of misfortune that had become almost routine. Alvin Smith, Jr.'s older brother, stepped forward to manage family affairs, taking on responsibilities their father increasingly could not handle. Reports suggest Joseph Sr. struggled with alcoholism, a burden that dulled his judgment and left him incapable of steady leadership. Historian Richard L. Bushman notes, Alvin may have taken the lead because his discouraged father could not. Alvin had co-signed the articles for the land purchase in 1821, suggesting he was serving as auxiliary family head. Joseph Sr., worn down by setbacks, may have partially abdicated or failed to undertake family leadership. Only after Alvin's death, when Joseph was 17, did responsibility for family leadership fall on Joseph, under the tacit family agreement that Joseph Sr. was not fully adequate. He was a gentle, disappointed man with an inclination to compensate for his failures with magic and drink. While the church often portrays such claims as unfair character attacks, contemporaneous evidence supports the portrait of Joseph Sr. as a man battling both external pressures and internal weaknesses. Local grocer Lemuel Durfee meticulously recorded sale of cider liquor to Hiram and Samuel between 1827 and 1828, while a 1834 entry captures Joseph Sr. blessing Hiram and acknowledging his own struggles. Though he has been out of the way, through wine, thou hast never forsaken him, nor laughed him to scorn. By 1821, the burden of the household had shifted to Alvin, the eldest son, who quietly assumed duties his father could no longer manage. His steadiness kept the family afloat through another cycle of loss and relocation. These fragments reveal a family living at the intersection of poverty, debt, and addiction. Each setback, lost farms, mounting obligations, and the shadow of alcohol, was a lesson etched into Joseph Jr.'s formative years. Understanding the Smith family's hardships is essential to understanding him. The crushing weight of responsibility, the exposure to human frailty, and the constant threat of failure all provided the crucible in which his religious imagination and ambition were forged. Part B, the children of the household. At the helm of this next generation was Alvin Smith, the eldest, whose sense of duty became apparent early. As their father floundered under repeated setbacks and increasingly relied on alcohol to numb disappointment, Alvin assumed burdens that would have challenged any adult, managing the farm, clearing dense woodland, planting crops, and tapping maple trees for sugar. Each task carried both physical strain and the weight of family expectation, and Alvin approached them with a mixture of pragmatism and quiet determination. James Allen and Glenn Leonard note that he even labored as a carpenter's helper, scrimping and saving to secure a down payment on the family's Manchester Township farm. He moved with the care of a young man who understood that the family's survival rested on his shoulders, balancing the practical needs of daily life with the unpredictable temperament of a father who sometimes drank to excess when faced with failure. Even as Alvin managed the household, he shared the Smith family's fascination with treasure-seeking, accompanying his father and brother Joseph Jr. on excursions that blended folklore, folk magic, and entrepreneurial hope. These journeys were more than idle pastime. They reflected a family worldview where ambition, superstition, and the pursuit of providence intertwined, shaping both daily routines and the imagination of the children. Though his life was tragically cut short in his early 20s, Alvin's steadfastness left a lasting imprint, establishing a measure of stability and responsibility amid the chaos of financial missteps, mystical pursuits, and a father's drinking. His influence would resonate through the household long after he was gone, subtly guiding Joseph Jr.'s emerging character and ambitions. Hiram Smith, younger than Alvin but older than Joseph Jr., grew up in a home where ambition, risk, and superstition tangled with daily life. Born in Tunbridge, Vermont in 1800, he watched his older brother shoulder the family's burdens while his father drifted toward risky ventures and, at times, the bottle. Hiram's path was different. Between ages 12 and 15, he attended Moore's Charity, a branch of Dartmouth College, living nearby in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Surrounded by scholarly mentors like his uncle John Smith, a theology professor and Hebrew scholar, and immersed in Masonic and fraternal networks, Hiram absorbed lessons in logic, ritual, and discipline, an education worlds apart from the labor that defined Alvin's life. Hiram was originally named Hiram, a choice that some suggest hinted at Joseph Sr.'s Masonic, Hiram Abiff being a central figure in Masonic lore. By 1826, Hiram became Hiram, a small but deliberate change, a phonetic nudge to ensure the name was spoken as intended. Even this subtle act reflected the household's mix of practicality, ritual, and attention to legacy. Joseph Smith Jr. arrived into this swirling mix of labor, study, and mystical preoccupations. The third son, he absorbed the household's contradictions. A father prone to financial missteps and drink, older siblings balancing responsibility and ambition, and a mother whose imagination and faith painted the world with visions and portents. Joseph's early years were shaped by chores and treasure-seeking expeditions, reading alongside Hiram and listening to stories of spirits, visions, and hidden gold. Samuel H. Smith, quiet but observant, moved through these same corridors of responsibility, carrying messages, tending animals, learning neighbors' routines, a bridge between the chaos of older siblings and the domestic rhythm of the household. Catherine Smith Salisbury, their eldest sister in the middle ranks of the household, kept its fragile order. She cooked, mended, and tended younger children, anchoring the home with a steady presence. Observant and articulate, she would later become the family's chronicler, her memory a window into the family's early life, though contemporary neighbors recorded little of her personality beyond domestic duties. William Smith, wild and stubborn, brought sparks wherever he went. He challenged authority, debated, and joined in magical practices, from seer stones to folk healing, pulling the household's hidden eccentricities into daylight. He reminded everyone that the Smith home was a place where the mundane and the mystical collided. Don Carlos, one of the youngest, moved in the shadow of older siblings' exploits. He joined in chores, schooling, and religious conversation, absorbing lessons of resilience and ambition. But life would not allow him long. In 1841, cholera swept through, taking him at just 25, even as he stepped into leadership roles in church publishing. The Smith siblings grew up in a crucible of ambition, superstition, and hardship. He carved a distinct role. Alvin the steady worker, Hiram the earnest scholar, Sophronia the quiet chronicler, Joseph Jr. the restless dreamer, and others who played at trickster or seeker. Together they forged a household where labor, learning, and mystical fascination mingled freely. Poverty demanded resilience, but curiosity invited experiment. Farm toil met folk magic. Scripture met treasure-seeking. The mixture of skill, struggle, and imagination that defined the Smith household created an environment in which Joseph Jr.'s curiosity and spiritual restlessness could flourish. Amid the rhythms of farm work, lessons in Scripture, and exposure to diverse religious ideas, he began to wrestle with questions that would not be easily answered. It is from this restlessness, born of duty, observation, and persistent doubt that the story of the visions, and ultimately the Book of Mormon, emerges.